So let's move on to the next question, guys. In this question, we are given that Patty has a 90% chance of answering a question correctly in the exam, right? And we are also given that there are less than 10 questions which are present in the exam paper. We have to tell what is the probability that Patty will answer all the questions correctly, and we have to compare that with 50%, right? So tell me one thing. Uh, so we are given that there are less than 10 questions which are present in the exam, right? So there can be one question, two question, three question, four question, five, whatever. So let's assume there is uh, there can be one question, two, three, up to nine, right? So either there can be one question in the exam, or two question, or three, up till nine questions, right? Because we know there are less than 10 questions which are present in the exam, right? So tell me one thing. For example, if there is only one question which is present in the exam, or let's say there are two questions present in the exam, right? So in exam there are two questions. So what is the probability that Patty will answer all the questions correctly? Means there are two questions in the exam and we have to answer both of these questions correctly, right? So if there are two questions, right? So probability of answering both the questions correctly means you will answer the first question correctly and you will answer the second question also correctly, right? So what is the probability of answering the question correctly? Patty has a 90% chance of answering correctly. That means there is a 0.9 probability. 90% chance means 90 upon 100, right? Which means 0.9. That means there is a probability of 0.9 that Patty will answer the question correctly. I hope this makes sense. Now we know there are two questions, right? And we want that Patty answers both the questions correctly. So obviously, if she answers the first question correctly, the probability will be 0.9, right? And if she answers the second question also correctly, the probability will again be 0.9. And because these are independent events, right? Because if Patty gets the first answer correctly, there is no relationship with the second question. She might or she might not get the second question correctly. What I mean is, the first question and the second question both are independent events, right? And when the events are independent, to calculate the probability, we multiply, right? So we want Patty should answer all the questions correctly. There are two questions in the exam. So what is the probability she will answer the question correctly? 0.9. What is the probability that she will answer the second question correctly? 0.9. And to find the total probability, you multiply both of this. So this gives us 0.81, right? So 0.81, or you can write this as 81%, right? You can write this as 81%. I hope this makes sense. But this was the case when we assumed there were two questions present in the exam. But we know there are less than 10 questions. So there can be 3 question, 4 question, 5 question, 6 question, 7 question, right? Up till 9 questions. Now, for example, tell me one thing. Let's assume there are, let's say, 9 questions in the exam, right? If there are 9 questions in the exam, what is the probability that she will answer all the questions correctly? The probability will be 0.9 into 0.9 into 0.9 into 0.9, 9 times. For example, this was 0.9 into 0.9 two times because two questions. Similarly, if there are 9 questions, so 0.9 into 0.9 into 0.9, 9 times. So that means 0.9 to the power 9. I hope this makes sense because every question probability of answering correctly is 0.9 because there are 9 questions. So 0.9 into 0.9 into 0.9, you have to do this for 9 times. So that will give you 0.9 to the power 9. Now, if you actually try and solving this, right? If you actually, for example, multiply 0.9 into 0.9 into 0.9 into 0.9. For example, 9 9 is 81. 81 into 9, 729. 729 into 9 is how much? 81, 9 to the 18, 26, 63, 6, 0.6561. For example, this is 0.9 to the power 4. Similarly, on the calculator, when you multiply this 9 times, you will get some figure which is less than 0.5. Basically, you might get 0.3, 0.35, 0.4, whatever. If you calculate this on the calculator, you will get some figure. For example, when we calculated 0.9 into 0.9, we got 0.8. Similarly, when you calculate 0.9 into 0.99 times, you will get some figure which can be 0.3, 0.4, 0.5. I don't know. We'll have to calculate on the calculator. But the point is, it will be less than 0.5, right? Which means it will be less than 50%. Which means it will be less than 50%. Right? So now tell me one thing. The probability Patty will answer the question correctly. One case is where the probability is 81%, right? And in 81%, obviously 81 is greater than 50, so that is why the answer becomes A. If you talk about this case, the 9 questions case, the answer is less than 50. It can be 40, 30, 20, 25, 35, whatever. But in this case, obviously 50 will be greater than this. That is why the answer becomes B. So sometimes the answer is A, sometimes the answer is B. Therefore, your final answer becomes D. So I hope this should be pretty clear. Because we were asked and given in the question, there are less than 10 questions. So there can be 1, 2, 3, 9. We usually take the extreme cases. So we took one case over here and we took one case over here. And then we calculate. We saw sometimes the answer is smaller, sometimes the answer is greater. That is why the final answer becomes D. So I hope this should be absolutely clear.